Institute of Life Sciences. So all my alma maters have given me a training basically coming from the chemistry to the biomedical area. So even now, my interest lies both in the interdisciplinary area of chemical sciences as well as biological sciences. And so we do develop and utilize a lot of materials which for which we take the help of chemistry, and then we try to understand the downstream applications in the interface of chemistry and biology. So this is Institute of Life Sciences. I'm sure all the participants today are very well aware of this institute. I also take this opportunity to welcome you all once things open up to come visit the facility at ILS, because it is one of the very well connected and very infrastructurally very strong place to work with. Any collaborations, any consultations, any help, we have a very strong team of scientific advisors and the scientists, also the fellow students, everyone. And we welcome you for any future collaborations or any anywhere where we can be of any help in terms of infrastructure. You all are very, very welcome. So this is something probably a bit redundant, because I am sure all through these 5 days you've heard enough about how the nano world looks like, what comprises of this world, how do they define the nanosciences, or how do they determine what should be nano and what should be kept out of the nanoscale. So just to take you over, of course, it is in the nanometer range. And in the biomedical segment also, you will find a lot of materials as on the top panel of the slide. Your ribonucleic acids or your proteins, a lot can be understood from the nano perspective. And while designing nanomaterials for biomedical area, there are a lot of designs that have come up successfully, a lot to the clinical trial, and a lot being taken up in the market as well. So they do comprise of micelles or some polyelectrolyzed based micelles. We have liposomes. A lot must have come to your ears when we heard about all the vaccines that were being developed for the COVID-19 virus. Then a lot of theranostic approaches coming up on the magnetic nanoparticle conjugated nucleic acid systems as well. So I wouldn't go much in detail on each of these, because I'm sure you have got a very good glimpse from our previous speakers on how they are made or what are the rationales in preparing them. But I will take you to what actually we mean, or what actually we do when we try to target something using the nano materials. So I personally consider, or from my past experience, or from my past trainings in this field of nanoscience, what I personally feel as one of the loopholes that still needs to be fixed, or where we still need young faculties or young research scholars to come in, is definitely the area of targeting. So I think it's a commendable job that the organizers have done in picking up this topic as well, where they have focused on that it's all about targeting. No matter what you prepare, it might be in any phase of that scale, of that nanoscale or the micro scale or the macro scale, things tend to lose their specificity, because if they're not well targeted, they might have erroneous results to end up with. So there are two types of targeting that nanoscientists mostly look at. The first one, of course, is the more conventional passive targeting, where the diseased site is considered to have very leaky vasculatures, and this specifically implies to the field of cancer research. So the whole concept came up in the perspective of cancer research. So they considered that these sites or these tumor environments contain a lot of leaky vasculatures. And thus the concept of enhanced permeation and a retention effect came into picture when they say if you have nanosystems and you have leaky vasculatures around a specific site, then these nanosystems take the advantages of these leaky systems to get into the site. The more advanced form of targeting, when people started understanding how these tumor sites must be looking like, or with a lot of innovations or lot of brainstorming from other biomedical areas as well, when researchers got a hold on how or what should be more expressing, or how the morphology or what should be the main characteristic of these sites, they started understanding that okay, if the nanosystems can be actually designed with something that is very specific to the site, you have a better possibility or a better chance of targeting through what they termed as active targeting. So, some small videos to just let you get the difference of what I actually meant by saying what is active and what is passive. So, this is how a passive targeting happens. So, you do inject things and you have all your nanosystems into it. Of course, the size is very important when you are looking only at passive targeting. So you have your nanosystems delivered intravenously. So these are the enhanced permeation. These are the leaky things, and they just escaped and sat on the tumor or on the site. Okay. Now coming to the active part, how does the active thing happen?
The nanoparticles can be modified so that they attach to the cancer cell and get carried inside. To make sure that the drug-loaded nanoparticles only attack the disease cells, they are engineered so that they only bind to the target cancer cells and not to neighboring healthy cells. Once they bind to the cancer cell, they are taken into the cell. They can't pass through the surface. Instead, part of the cell surface forms a pit, and then it engulfs the nanoparticle. Now we are looking inside the cell. Cellular proteins wrap around the vesicle and drive it inside the cell. You can now see a vesicle carrying the nanoparticle moving towards the very center of the cell. The vesicle carrying the nanoparticle travels further inside the cell and then fuses with a compartment called an endosome. This is part of the digestive system of the cell's stomach. The inside is acidic, and its job is to digest common material.
Okay. So I hope it was clear enough of what the difference was. So the field has definitely done very well in the last decade, and there has been introduced a lot of versatility and a lot of engineering in developing these carriers to be aptly suiting to either the passive targeting or the active targeting. So now with the advanced engineering and the advanced techniques of preparing these nanosystems have come into play, they can be loaded onto a lot of drugs at the same time. So kind of co-delivery and co-loading of multiple drugs. Your surface can be designed into a lot of with a lot of moieties that are meant to target specific regions or zones on your target site. Then you can even have your contrasting agents if you're looking at diagnostics as an application. You can have extra moieties encapsulated inside for its easy uptake and relocation when they are inside within the cell matrix. So now, with what I also earlier said of the type of nanoparticles that have already been developed in this field, there is one specific category that is considered, or that is kind of has kept the researchers on a bit of tenterhooks. The category especially comprising of inorganic nanomaterials. So they are doing extremely well in terms of theranostics, be it gold, be it quantum dots, be it iron magnetic nanoparticles or carbon nanotubes. Exciting properties, a lot of potential opportunities, and giving good results as well. But they have been specifically a matter of concern in certain cases, leading to their toxicity. Now, what exactly happens is, and why it happens, is because there are certain driving factors when your nanosystem is uptaken by a cell. So your nanoparticles can be taken up by a lot of different mechanisms, depending, of course, on the property of your nanoparticles. They can either degrade in endosomes or lysosomes, or they are left open to freely interact with any of the cellular machinery. So, what I mean to say is, your cellular machinery is looking at performing responses such as transcription or protein expression or whatever. And if your nanoparticles have a notorious character and they start interfering with any of these systems when they are free to do so, that kind of creates, or that kind of drives towards a lot of unwanted or undesirable responses, such as, apoptosis, necrosis, some of these established mechanisms kind of get affected with these free nanoparticles. So you can kind of imagine or visualize that there is an interaction. So if your origin is a bit problematic, or they are not very well taken up, or they have an interfering nature, they might interfere with one of the established roots of established work of your cellular machinery. So, a very beautiful representation by one of the leading authors in this field, where they talk about the different mechanisms that lead to nanotoxicity. So, beginning from an adhesion or interaction with the cell membrane, to all the way to having an impact on its unwanted accumulation in one of the organelles. So all these are the possible routes that have already been identified as being responsible mechanisms towards nanotoxicity. So a lot of authors have also been vocal about having nanotoxicology as a specific subcategory of toxicology, because they are kind of sure that this there is a cell damage through interaction with specific biomolecules, or there are different mechanisms like induction of your reactive oxygen species. There are morphological dysfunctions, morphological modifications, or even the nanoparticle degradation and immunological effects are also high. So this kind of this field is demanding that nanotoxicology be established as one of the very important research areas in the field of nanoscience. Now, now, actually, why I have put this in the as a very particular star mark is the ROS production has been pointed out to be one of the very effective mechanisms leading to nanotoxicity. Now, what is actually this ROS doing? So, the imbalance between the production and your accumulation of your ROS, which is a oxygen reactive species, leads to the occurrence of a kind of oxidative stress in the cells and live tissues. So ROS generates, I mean, there are mitochondrial dysfunctions as well, coming both from physiological and pathological conditions, and they're all, they're all free radicals, so you cannot keep away their benefits as well. They do have favorable benefits at low or moderate concentrations, such as they are very good in fighting with pathogens. You do need them to for a lot of cell signaling and synthesis of various different cellular structures and proteins. However, above a certain concentration, the oxidative stress conditions takes place, in which the ROS actually suppresses the live cells and organs' ability to detoxify the cell. The entire cell fails to detoxify itself, and unfortunately, this can have a leading impact on your proteins, your lipids, your nucleic acids, and this leads severely to cell death and disease progression, which also includes diseases like cancer. So, kind of disrupting the mechanism, but then above a certain concentration. So it is very important. This what I'm trying to take you towards is, it's not a clear yes or a no. I mean, it's not a complete white or a black region, but we need to understand what exactly leads to these kind of toxicity. For example, your ROS, as I said, or as I mentioned, does have an important aspect, as influence on your selectivity. So you cannot completely rule out the presence of these free radicals, but then you need to understand and determine the relationship or the bridge or the interface in which your nanosystem and the ROS production might go towards a negative impact rather than having a positive impact. Then your nanoparticles are also susceptible to degradation in this kind of a physiological environment. So they are either in the late endosomes or the lysosomes after endocytic uptake. Now, when they phase enzymes like cathepsin at a pH of 5.6 in the late endosomes or 4.5 in case of lysosomes, this degradation or dissolution of your nanoparticles can also result in the leaching of free ions or an increase in reactive surface groups, which happens actually in cases like when you have quantum dots. So there are certain key aspects or key features, such as the concentration of a nanoparticle, that that needs a very prominent understanding from the very beginning of your designing of your nano vehicle. Now, how do the researchers assess nanotoxicity? So they have categorized. So this table entirely sums up the entire thing. So you have your classical assays, both in vitro and in vivo. So the in vitro are all cell line based. You kind of understand the cytotoxicity, the genotoxicity, inflammation, oxidative stress, and then move towards your in vivo systems. Both your in vitro and in vivo, based on your in vitro results, you move to your in vivo system, and depending on what you have observed in your in vitro cell lines, you determine your experimental parameters or you design your models in your in vivo systems accordingly. Both of this come under the classical assays, but there are other upcoming very advanced assays coming up. The omics techniques are very widely coming up. You have genomics, transcriptomics, proteomics. All these can also be utilized for assessing your nanotoxicity. The different areas from where you can derive your target. You have cell lines, you have primary cells, you have co-cultures, then even advanced biofluid metabolomics, tissue metabolomics. So they, from your untargeted, they are now very well moving towards your targeted omics techniques as well. But what I want here to just bring out the fact that why did we actually move from classical to more advanced techniques? With the routine methods of nanotoxicity testing, actually, it was noted that they kind of discrepancies came up. Different groups were not able to reproduce different results. And that's how the whole idea that there might be some issues coming up with what the routine tests or routine in vitro and in vivo methods may not be looking at the correct way of representing nanotoxicity in certain cases. For example, what I mean is routine in vitro methods are, they are the first ones to be conducted during a toxicological evaluation. So most in vitro studies were considered in classical and 2D monocultures of cell lines, although the use of, stem cells or primary cells is also increasing. So now the selection of a relevant cell type was depending on the expected in vivo target organ and the application. So in a vast majority of the studies, the cells are exposed to the nanoparticle dispersion during a single incubation period, something like 3 days to 48 hours. So the induced toxicity is subsequently evaluated either using a biochemical assay or an enzymatic assay with fluorometry, with spectrophotometry. And these kind of results or these detection principles were very straightforward, but they were not able to give a complete overview or a complete picture of can they be taken into your in vivo methods. Similarly, in vivo methods normally were mostly like from your in vivo methods from draw conclusions from your in vitro studies mostly in the form of dose range. So, for example, you have determined in an in vitro experiment a dose range or a realistic exposure dose as we call it, and from there you determine your studies. But the choice of a model was also very crucial in this case. So, it came up that there are certain instances where your classical methods of in vitro or in vivo studies were creating some kind of issues in giving a holistic picture of the toxicity, because there were batch to batch or experiment to experiment variation from labs to labs. Now, they categorized into four broad categories the issues. The first one was, of course, the characterization of the nanoparticles. That was the first shortcoming to this strategy. So it is when we work also with nanosystems, it becomes nearly impossible to retrieve all reliable conclusions on the effect of a specific parameter, since there are many parameters such as you have a size, you have charge, you have shape, you have a lot of surface properties. So which one to take into account and which one to omit? And it could so happen that if you have omitted one of the characteristics, that is creating your toxicity assay to go wrong. So a nanoparticle actually needs to be fully characterized in terms of whatever I listed now. For example, the charge, the size, the shape. And these should not differ from studies to studies. So you have to develop a method where you fully characterize of what you're looking at, because any parameter that you leave might have an impact on the final assay. Now, the next one that was playing a very important role was the concentration. So, nanoparticle concentration is actually one of the parameters that needs a special attention, because expressing it needs special attention because how do you express nanoparticle concentration? The first thing was a consensus was needed on the method to determine how you should express the concentration of a nanoparticle. Is it, I mean, the unit in which this parameter has to be reported. Expressing the concentration in terms of mass per volume is the most easiest one that goes in the field. So you have mass, you have volume, so you express it as mass per volume. But that may not be always relevant, as smaller nanoparticles often, create a stronger toxic response in comparison to their larger counterparts at similar mass per volume doses. So now, when you are doing concentration, your other character is creating a problem. So, uh, what most of the established labs do is they kind of express the concentration in terms of surface area per volume. Since in that case, you take into consideration both the particle size as well as the number, and both of them are contained in this matrix, because the toxicological response depends on the surface properties which is known, and the surface area exponentially increases with the decrease in nanoparticle size. So if you take into consideration surface area per volume, then that gives you a very good idea of how you should express your nanoparticle concentration. The next thing was the standardization of the nanotoxicity methods, like the steps, the relevant dose range, and mimics like that. So the issue is actually very complex, and it has to consider both intentional as well as unintentional exposure to your nanosystems. So a standardization of the toxicology methods was the call for the hour. So researchers really needed to think about what and how to standardize this method. They also pointed out on things like assay interference. What is assay interference is, and I personally consider it as a major issue in the potential of nanoparticle interference, because nanoparticles with optical properties, for example, they may alter the outcome of an assay based on a spectrophotometric or a fluorometric readout. For example, nanoparticles may interact with enzymes or substrates because of their own absorbance capacity or catalytic activity, and then it gives you a misleading result on whether you are seeing it on a fluorometric assay, you are seeing it on a spectrophotometric assay. So if they have a property of their own, then you need to try and understand what kind of assay you should take into consideration to understand its property, so that its inherent character is not being interfered by the assay itself. In the in vivos, and mostly these are known to create an issue with in vitro systems more than with in vivo systems. So then the key aspects were carefully, now they are very well documented. They are very well categorized. So these can be summarized as the key aspects for improving your nanotoxicity studies, which first begins with a very careful characterization of your nanoparticles. You have composition, you have size and size distribution, you have other physicochemical properties such as a surface and colloidal stability. It is very important in which medium are you trying to understand your nanoparticles. Then you're in the biological fluid. So first you characterize it in a non-interfering medium where you think they just exist in fluid, and then maybe you try to mimic as much as possible the real biological environment by introducing other proteins and then understanding its colloidal stability. So this goes in line, and this is one after the other should be performed in a very categorical way. You have the standardization of the toxicity assays, which I was referring to in the previous slide. So what are the relevant concentrations to be taken? What are the different incubation times that you can consider? What are the relevant cell types and the type of assays used depending on the chosen cell type? Then you have a definition of your critical parameters depending again on what assays you have taken up and which cell line. So different cell line will have different critical parameters, and that has to be determined again on the type of assay that you have chosen for that cell type. Then large scale comparative studies, you have to take care of your batch to batch variation. You have to use a range of nanoparticle concentration and incubation times, compare with different type of nanoparticles in a single setup to assess the size of your other physical chemical properties. Then definition of a standard reference material to be included for easy comparison. You have a defining it in, so this again is kind of getting or having a more detailed view on your concentration assays and correlating it very, very carefully with your toxic levels with the cellular uptake studies. Then on long-term effects, what is the fate of the nanoparticles after the cellular uptake? Evaluate it after intracellular degradation, excretion, or persistence, and then if nanoparticle degrades or remains, how will it actually affect the cell physiology? So, whenever you are uptaking and any research or any idea, these points needs to be validated. You need to plan your research taking all these criterias into consideration, or propose something taking into consideration all this to have an idea about whether your nanosystem is actually leading to toxicity or not. Now, the main physicochemical parameters actually which are known to have a toxic effect. So the major ones are listed here, although this is not all comprehensive, I would say. You have size dependent, because it is very well known. I am sure a lot of people must be knowing what is the size dependent toxicity of a lot of nanoparticles. For example, if you have a certain range in terms of mostly for gold nanoparticles, you if they are too small in size, they are more toxic than if they have a certain cutoff range. Mm, and they're also organ specific, I must say. The distribution, the it's which organ are you actually targeting to. Shape of your nanoparticles also have a very big influence on the toxicity. You have spheres, ellipsoids, now cylinders, sheets coming up, and every shape is known or is contributing towards toxicity. Again, you need to very well understand where you are targeting it. For example, people have indicated that if you have a plate like or a nanoparticle or a needle like nanoparticle, they kind of induce more necrosis portions than other spherical or rod like nanoparticles, since these shapes have a more capacity to induce physical damages to cells and live tissues by direct contact. So it is very important to understand whether you need a certain shape and where do you need that shape. The other one definitely are the chemical compositions. Then you have your crystal structures. So the structure in the microscopic or the macroscopic level of your material. Surface charge, very important. A lot of people want positive charges on their surface. A lot of research wants negative charges. But then you have to very carefully understand, is there a effect of this charge on your target cell line or your target organ, or wherever you want it to be applied. Then of course the solubility, because if your nanoparticle or your nanosystem has a poor solubility, that leads to major aggregation in your biological fluids, and then your concentration dependency is not very well taken care of, and this aggregation often leads to a lot of toxic uh, properties that you will notice it abrupt. I mean, we have seen that if we do not have a very well dispersed nano system, the moment you put it in the medium that you want it to be delivered, it is going to be definitely very toxic. And these metal nanoparticles, they contribute in a way. If they are not very soluble, then they kind of release the ions, which are again directly proportional or dependent on the nanoparticle dissolution rate. Zinc nanoparticles. We cannot keep away all the usage of these inorganic nanoparticles in our daily lives, be it creams or be it shampoos. And everything needs to be considered from a perspective that the shape, the targeting, where, how, what is leading to your toxic behavior of these materials. So probably very slowly I can try to go over some of these metallic nanoparticles, that are already known to have created an effect on existing system. So this is like, since I talked about charge, this is a silver nanoparticle that is it is I mean, is the most widespread antibacterial agent. Like I said, no, these inorganic nanoparticles have found a very wide and convincing application in a lot of materials these days, and silver being one of the most widespread used as an antibacterial agent. So, and silver salts are also utilized as agents for the treatment of different bacterial infections even. They are also used as bactericides due to its attainment in antibiotic resistance. But they have, the great potential to attach to the cell membrane. So they have through the charges, they have a very strong interaction with the membrane, and these silver nanoparticles are able to construct kind of a destructive binding with the genomic DNA and prevent direct replication. So it can also decrease the effectivity of enzymes and other proteins in the transcription stage. So this is how the interaction actually happens. So, and that is dose dependent. So the dose of a silver nanoparticle that is utilized, or that is being utilized, should be taken into consideration very carefully. These are your gold nanoparticles, another metal that has found widespread application. I mean, gold is doing tremendously well in the nanoscience area, and they are being used to evaluate cellular uptake, tissue distribution, and they are very easy to detect by electron microscopy, and several other applications which I'm sure everyone must be knowing. So, they are very size dependent. The toxicity of gold nanoparticles have been very well reported to be size dependent. For example, if you have something like a 2 nanometer gold or a 5 nanometer gold is considered to be among the most toxic conditions, and results in rapid cell death by necrosis, well established. Whereas if you go above 20 nanometers or even above 15 nanometers, you do not see these toxic effects with the gold nanosystems. And what you are seeing here is actually related to bone marrow toxicity in rats. And you see that this study particularly has shown that gold nanoparticles accumulated in the hematopoietic bone tissue, and that led to severe side effects such as megakaryosis. And also increased levels of white blood cells and platelets were found after these rats were treated with the gold nanoparticles. So again, dose dependent, size dependent, which tissue or which organ are you actually targeting with? The same with copper. Copper also has great advantages. So they have a very special characteristic called spin dynamics, because of which they are being used for high temperature superconductivity and electron correlation effects. But they can be found in two ionic conditions: copper 1 and copper 2 plus. So with biochemical reactions, it is very interesting. It can be both a reducing or an oxidizing agent. However, very unfortunately, it is not very favorable from the toxicity assay point of view, because copper ions are capable to induce oxidative stress. They are very famous for creating this ROS dependent effects when they are taken up. So what this model is actually showing is they are mostly taken up by endocytosis. Then they go to the lysosomes and via autophagy, but there is a ROS generation, and then there are other molecules that get mitigated by the antioxidants, and several other downstream things taking place, finally ending with the possibility of having DNA damage and cell death by apoptosis. Again, titanium oxide, the same kind of the effect from titanium also. Titanium is finding a lot of application in bone related materials, and I mean, great to have them with their unique property of biocompatibility, they are knowing their corrosion resistance. So a lot of bone screws, bone pins you will see are made up of titanium, because specifically because of their corrosion resistance property. Their surface structure is also great, but then above certain concentration, they do show some kind of a toxicity behavior as well. So this is kind of a TEM image where you see that they are how they are interacting with CACO2 cells, and they kind of accumulate, so aggregation happening, and then leading to regions of cell death. Zinc oxide is also the same. I will not go into detail, but then you see regions not with zinc oxide nanoparticles above certain concentrations, creating some kind of toxicity effect. Although you may also argue that zinc and zinc oxides are listed as one of the safest substance by the FDA. So the US Food and Drug Administration has listed them on the safe list, and in vitro toxicity investigations they have very well specified that there is a very specific range around 50 nanometers above or below which have been considered to have a toxic effect. Mm, and mostly it is the charge-based toxicity that they induce, and that happens after their cellular uptake and intracellular location, and doesn't look very promising in that way. So now coming to whatever we have seen with very exciting properties, with very exciting applications, we are still limited to three categories of their synthesis or preparation. So the first one that we are left to is a chemical approach, which is the most widely used approach for preparing these nanosystems. We have the physical ones, then physical approach, and then we physical approach is mostly the top down approach where you take the help of techniques like ultrasound or microwave irradiation or electrochemical methods. The chemical, of course, the chemical precursors or the stabilizing agents, reducing agents. The third one that is coming up, that is kind of overcoming all the above said slides or all the above said properties, is the green approach of preparing these nanosystems. And what is striking, or what I want to show, is they are actually overcoming all the limitations that I have listed so far. So some of the principles, of course, everyone must agree and must have heard a lot on this program throughout the 5 days, is they do prevent a lot of waste. They use less hazardous chemical synthesis. They have a very unique way of using safer solvents or reaction media. They're designed in a way that they kind of biodegrade. They have reduced derivatives, and they use inherently safer chemistry for their synthesis. So the advantages, as just mentioned, and needless to say that of course they are biocompatible in nature. They're providing surprisingly, they are also providing the ease of targeting. They are coming up with high drug conjugation ability, and they are also highly stable. Now, what are the methods that are already being used in the green synthesis of nanoparticles? So the current ones are using a lot of enzymes to prepare nanoparticles, vitamins to prepare. Then you have microwave assisted synthesis, which is also giving a lot of green nanoparticles with a very exciting properties. Then you have bio-based methods also. And bio-based methods are utilizing bacteria, actinomyces, yeasts, algae, plants, phytochemicals. All these are now being classified as bio-based methods. And you will be surprised to see that all the ones that I listed in my above slides as the metals having great applications or having established applications being widely marketed but having toxicity issues, if they are prepared in a green way, and they are being prepared, they are able to be prepared by enzymes or vitamins, for example. um, even gold nanoparticles with vitamin B2. There's a group who is preparing gold nanoparticles using vitamin 2. They are all able to end up with nanosystems with properties and characteristics quite similar to their chemical or physical counterparts. So all these I've listed the systems or the metal nanoparticles which you can still utilize, and they are, if they are prepared from the green synthesis method, using one of the above methodologies, you are able to have the same properties, the same targetability, and the same usability as your other counterparts. Now I would come to, why should I be talking about it? Why should I be discussing? I mean, um, what, where, or how my experience would have counted in letting you know about, yes, this toxicity does happen. So I would like to uh, make you aware of some of my personal experiences of how I came towards thinking about nanotoxicity. So when I was postdocing in Europe, in one of the projects that was funded by the Magister, it was a European Union project. And back then, in 2012, 2013, when it was not very, it was not very common to think first about the negatives of nanosystems, but that was an era that was really proposing the benefits of having nanosystems. And in one of my projects that I got to work with, I was supposed to develop nanosystems for theranostics. So starting from my lab, so that lab was actually a very polymer based lab where we used a lot of polymers as our base material to start developing nanosystems. So, of course, the polymeric matrix or the polymer that we had in hand was not able to do the purpose of the theranostics. So it had to go through different steps. It was, of course, a functional carrier. It was supposed to target tumor cells. It was supposed to also have a diagnostic property. Then it had to have a therapeutic angle, and then finally come up with the combined approach of having as a theranostic material. So the targeting moiety that we were supposed to have on these nanosystems were folic acid, and the entrapped material was supposed to be paclitaxel because we were targeting it to the tumor cells. So this is what we were supposed to do. This was a workflow that was proposed in the project. Now, of course, we were a polymer group and we started our work with a polymer that we had in hand, and it was a block copolymer. And then, doing our regular chemical stuffs to get the folic acid into it, got fascinating results of internalization. But at that point of time back then, we realized something is not okay if you take things to the from the in vitro to the in vivo. We did successfully publish this out on the in vitro system, but when we took it to the in vivo system, we did not get, or we did not end up with the results that we were expecting and we were drawing from our in vitro system. We did see there is some kind of a degradation happening from our polymeric block nano material, which was the base of the nanoparticle. So the folic acid was on the surface. It was supposed to go and bind to the tumor and then open up the polymeric nanoparticles so that the paclitaxel comes out. So 10 years ago, this concept itself was, achieving this concept itself was pretty fancy, and in vitro we didn't have any problem. But when we took to the in vitro, we did understand that our block copolymer was degrading in a way. So one of the things that I listed in my earlier slide, saying that dissolution of nanoparticle is a crucial factor, this is what I meant. So when we had the in vitro physiological medium, it didn't really bother our nanosystem. But when it went to the real biological fluid of the mice model that we were doing, it kind of degraded in a fashion that was making the polymer go back to a monomer phase where it was creating a toxic effect. So then we moved to systems where we started introducing, more and more natural systems into the polymers to end up with particles and then evaluate them whether having one of the synthetic component with one of the natural components, does this effect of toxicity go away. So I cannot say, I mean, from my own experience, I have not tried to use a vitamin or all those bacterial starting points as developing nanosystems. So I've not utilized a real green or a direct green approach to get nanoparticles. But what our hypothesis was that if we start taking more natural systems into our consideration, then is the toxic effect going away. So we did a lot of my work revolves around having a hybrid system of natural and synthetic, because synthetic has its own potential of giving you very well dispersed nanosystems. A lot of them have already been in circulation for a while from my postdoc period. And we did see that, yes, the more you go towards the natural systems as your ingredients or your starting materials, a lot of better results are obtained. So back in India, my after relocating here some 3 years ago, my current focus is also towards looking a lot into therapeutic interventions, but my study model after coming back to India was in bone, is focusing in bone. So my lab at present is looking into developing 3D models, understanding adhesion into bone cells, developing microenvironments to create osteogenesis, understanding angiogenesis in these models. And so whatever is seen here is all in bits and pieces that we deal at the moment. So vascularization, mineralization. And one of the anecdotes that I want to draw here is how one of these phenomenons of again going back to a natural system has given me or my research an angle that yes, natural systems, the more and more taken into consideration while your research is being planned, does have a very positive effect. And so I look a lot into developing bioresorbable polymers or bioresorbable matrices. So my group revolves, or a lot of research in my group revolves around which category you are looking for replacement. So whether it is a cancellous bone, is a cortical bone, or it is mostly the porous biodegradable structures that we are trying. So what we try to do is, at the moment, we are trying to develop, matrices that can promote bone regeneration. And what could be the greener ways to do that? For example, if I tell you, you must all have heard about nanohydroxyapatite and the role or the benefits of nanohydroxyapatite, because bone is like the mineral component is nothing but hydroxyapatite. So back during one of my postdoc phases, I was looking into greener ways of developing this mineral. So basically, if I put it in a very plain language, it was like, can I have a better replacement of not using the synthetic nanohydroxyapatite, but get my own hydroxyapatite into my resorbable material? So what we do is, at that point of time, I started digging into mineralization, but then having a bio angle to it. So even biomineralization is a very wide field, and what chemistry or polymer chemists were doing is looking at macromolecules that can actually induce biomineralization. So biomineralization is nothing but, it's a process. It's a process in which you influence the precipitation of minerals, which is basically calcium and phosphate in a certain ratio if you want hydroxyapatite to be what you want it to be finally. So we started with, or the field starts with, a combination, whether it is inorganic or organic, and combining it with various structural ways in unique materials. The steps are very simple. You need a point of nucleation, and then from that point of nucleation, there are crystal growth, and that's how you start developing your crystals. And you get your calcium and phosphate in a certain ratio, which should be hydroxyapatite. So what my other part of the work has been focusing on is looking at alkaline phosphatase, which is a homodimeric enzyme, utilizing ALP to develop or to start nucleating in my scaffold material or in my matrix to deposit calcium phosphate. So if I say what is my greener approach was not directly going to utilizing synthetic nanohydroxyapatite in a matrix, but to look for ALP, which is an biological enzyme, to do the purpose that I want. So ALP actually has two catalytic sites, two zinc and one magnesium, actually three. So which is actually responsible for its enzymatic activity. So ALP is secreted by osteoblasts, so it is very well suited to my bone regeneration model, and I have utilized ALP to deposit these minerals and try to understand what kind of minerals are actually being deposited if I give them a polymer matrix. So for example, imagine that I have a defect to regenerate. I have a bone defect, which is a critical size defect, and I need to regenerate bone in that. So my matrix is a polymer matrix. Probably it is not as osteogenic as I want it to be. So I want it to be pre-treated with some minerals that is of hydroxyapatite origin or that is closely resembling hydroxyapatite. I choose ALP. I kind of tune ALP so that it gets into my matrix and it starts doing the job that of depositing my minerals, my calcium and phosphate in a mode that makes my matrix more osteogenic. And we have successfully did it on a lot of polymer surfaces, and what we have noticed is even if you have the same ALP wanting to deposit your calcium phosphate, if your matrix is of a different origin or different polymeric origin, we see that they are deposited in different ratios, they are deposited in different fashions, and they finally give you a resorbable material that varies in different kind of properties. So just a very short overview or a glance of this is of what a matrix that we mostly make for bioresorbable materials. And if you start treating them with your enzyme, this is how they start depositing. So whatever you see, this is nothing but minerals and all deposited by ALP. And this what you see is the ratio of the calcium and phosphate that ALP has deposited. So you see that in certain cases we are not close to hydroxyapatite. It does deposit, but then we are not close to hydroxyapatite, while in some cases it is closer. So what I want to say is you surely can have an origin, a biological origin or biological material that is serving the purpose, but of course a lot of fine tuning is required. It is not as direct, but we are kind of sure that we are not going towards any toxic or a hazardous material or a material that might have some kind of a nanotoxicity. So this is also nanohydroxyapatite, but more from a biological source. And this is how we characterize our mineralizations. In some cases where the ratio is 1 is to 1 or 1 is to 2, you see plate-like structures. In certain cases, if the ratio is closer, in certain matrices, that is, which is matrix dependent, you see they are of different nature or different structure or different morphology. And very exciting results if you try to follow, or if anyone is interested can always contact me. I can always share a copy of our publications, and we did see a very nice bone regeneration happening if we employed this ALP to do our job. So with this, I think and I hope that I was able to give you an overview. These are the histological images of successful mineralization happening and successful development of bone structures. And I hope that I was able to convince you that toxicity can be a factor. Toxicity it is definitely a factor to be considered, but it can be very well fine-tuned provided you know from the very beginning what kind of application you are looking at, and then accordingly plan or design your material in terms of the different parameters that I talked to you. With this, I would like to end here and take up any further discussions.